You stand at the edge of the ocean. There is no airport behind you, no road, no compass, no satellite above you, only water. And somewhere beyond that horizon is land you have never seen. Around 65,000 years ago, humans stood in almost exactly this position in what is now Southeast Asia. But they did something that still raises a difficult question. They crossed the sea, not a few hundred meters. They moved through a landscape that eventually carried them into Sahul, the prehistoric continent formed by Australia and New Guinea when sea levels were lower. And they did it without knowing what was waiting on the other side. For most of human history, crossing the world did not mean following a line on a map. It meant walking until the landscape changed, then walking farther, then deciding whether the unknown was safer than staying where you were. Here's the strange part. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago. That means your species was already capable of extraordinary movement tens of thousands of years before cities, writing, or organized states existed. The story of human migration is therefore not mainly a story about civilization. It is a story about ordinary people repeatedly stepping beyond the edge of what they knew. And the first clues appear in a place called Madjedbebe. In 2017, archaeologists reported evidence from this rock shelter in northern Australia suggesting humans were present there around 65,000 years ago. The excavation contained thousands of stone artifacts. There were grinding stones, stone flakes, ground-edge tools, remains connected with the processing of plants and other resources. You can imagine the scene. A small group moving through unfamiliar country. Someone carrying a stone tool. Someone carrying food. Someone watching the children. And everyone depending on knowledge that could not be written down. But Madjedbebe creates an even bigger problem. Australia is separated from mainland Southeast Asia by water. During periods of lower sea level, the distance was smaller than it is today. But it was never completely erased. Some stretches still required deliberate sea crossings. So these people did not simply walk across one continuous landmass. At some point, someone had to get into the water, and that changes the story, because accidental drifting is possible. A storm can carry anything, but reaching a destination repeatedly is different. It requires direction. It requires planning. It requires some understanding of where land might exist beyond the horizon. And perhaps most importantly, it requires a reason to leave familiar land in the first place. That is where prehistoric migration becomes difficult to explain. You might imagine that people moved because they were forced to. A drought, a predator, a shortage of food, a changing climate. Sometimes that probably happened. But humans also lived in places where survival was already possible. Yet, they kept moving. By around 45,000 years ago, humans had reached parts of Europe. By roughly 50,000 years ago, people were already living across large portions of Australia. And by 30,000 years ago, humans occupied environments ranging from tropical forests to extremely cold northern regions. The same species had adapted to all of them. Your body did not suddenly become a different machine for each environment. The adaptation was largely behavioral. You changed your tools, you changed your shelter, you changed what you ate, you changed how you traveled, and you carried something even more important than any physical object: knowledge. A person who knew where water was could be more valuable to a group than someone who could run the fastest. A person who knew how to recognize edible plants could keep everyone alive. A person who remembered where a river froze safely could determine whether the group crossed it or died trying. This kind of knowledge had to move from one brain to another. And that brings you to another archaeological clue. At Lake Mungo in Australia, human remains dating to roughly 40,000 years ago show that people had already developed complex ways of living in a challenging environment. The landscape around the ancient lake was not permanent. Water levels changed, resources moved, the climate shifted, yet humans remained. They did not survive because the environment stayed predictable. They survived because their behavior could change faster than the environment could destroy them. But here's where it gets stranger. The farther humans moved, the more they had to depend on something you still use every day. Memory became a survival tool. You could forget a face. You could forget a story. But forgetting where water was could kill you. Around 12,000 years ago, people living in Australia were already passing detailed knowledge about landscapes, animals, and water sources between generations. The landscape itself became a kind of map. A hill meant something. A particular rock meant something. A river bend meant something. A seasonal change meant something. You did not need a written map if you had someone who remembered the route. And this ability became increasingly important as humans moved into colder environments. Around 45,000 years ago, humans entered Ice Age Europe. You now had to survive winters that could last for months. Temperatures could fall dramatically. Large animals were available, but they were dangerous. Plants disappeared beneath snow. Water could become inaccessible. Yet humans continued moving north. At Kostenki, in western Russia, archaeological layers dating to roughly 40,000 years ago contain evidence of early modern human occupation. Stone tools appear alongside remains of animals, such as mammoths. The environment was radically different from the one your ancestors had known farther south, but the same basic human body arrived there. No thicker fur suddenly appeared. No new claws developed. Instead, you carried technology. You carried fire. You carried clothing. You carried memories. And you carried other people. That last part may have mattered more than almost anything else. A migration is rarely one person walking alone. It is a group carrying children, food, tools, and accumulated knowledge. When one person became injured, another could help. When someone found a new water source, everyone benefited. When a hunter learned an animal's seasonal route, that knowledge could survive after the hunter was gone. This creates a strange picture of human movement. You were not simply exploring. You were transporting information, and information allowed you to occupy places your body alone could never tolerate. At Sungir, near Vladimir in Russia, people were buried around 34,000 years ago, wearing remarkable quantities of personal ornaments and carefully worked objects. The site shows that these Ice Age communities were capable of producing complex objects and maintaining social traditions in environments far from the warmer regions where earlier humans had evolved. But there was another problem. You could not carry everything. A migrating group had to decide what was worth taking. Food, tools, fire-making materials, clothing, children, and sometimes nothing more than what could fit into your hands. Every additional object increased the burden. Every object left behind could become something you needed later. So movement required decisions, and those decisions became more difficult when the landscape itself disappeared. Imagine walking across an enormous frozen plain. There are no roads, no signs, no buildings, no visible border telling you where one region ends and another begins. The sun moves across the sky. The wind erases tracks. Snow covers landmarks. Yet humans cross these environments. At Madjedbebe, in Ukraine, people around 15,000 years ago built substantial structures using mammoth bones. More than 300 mammoth bones were incorporated into one of the famous structures at the site. The animals were not just food. Their bodies became architecture. Their bones became walls. Their environment became raw material. This is what happened again and again as humans moved into new landscapes. You did not conquer nature by overpowering it. You learned how to reuse what it gave you. But there was something even more important than tools. You needed to know when to move, because moving too early could mean leaving food behind. Moving too late could mean getting trapped by winter. And moving in the wrong direction could mean walking into an environment where your group could not survive. That meant prehistoric humans had to read time itself. The arrival of animals, the growth of plants, the freezing of rivers, the disappearance of snow, the position of the sun, the changing behavior of birds. A landscape could tell you when to leave. And once you understood those signals, migration stopped being random. It became a pattern. A route could be remembered. A route could be taught. And eventually, a route could become tradition. Except there was one journey where even the landscape could not tell you what came next. The ocean had no trail, and somewhere ahead was land you had never seen. The ocean was different. A mountain gives you a direction. A river gives you a path. An animal trail leaves evidence. The ocean gives you almost nothing, yet humans crossed it. Around 65,000 years ago, people reached Sahul, the prehistoric landmass that included Australia and New Guinea. Sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, but the islands of Southeast Asia were still separated by stretches of open water. At least one crossing had to be intentional. You had to leave land without knowing exactly what was ahead. The first people who made that journey could not look across the horizon and see Australia. They could only see water, and someone had to decide to go. Perhaps they followed birds. Perhaps they saw distant land. Perhaps generations of coastal movement slowly pushed them farther east. Archaeology cannot tell you the exact moment that decision was made, but it can tell you what happened afterward. Humans survived. They reached new environments. They learned unfamiliar plants. They hunted unfamiliar animals. They adapted their tools, and they stayed. Thousands of years later, humans were living across the Australian continent. Then they moved again. By around 50,000 years ago, humans had reached parts of the continent far from the original coastal entry points. The movement was no longer one journey. It was thousands of smaller journeys, one valley at a time, one river at a time, one generation at a time. This is important because human migration was probably not a single march across the planet. It was a chain. You moved a little farther. Your children grew up there. They learned the surrounding landscape. Then their children moved farther. After 10,000 generations, a species that had once occupied a relatively limited portion of Africa could exist on almost every major landmass. And you can still see the traces of that movement in your DNA. Modern humans carry genetic signatures of ancient population movements. The strongest evidence points to an origin of our species in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. Much later, populations expanded beyond Africa. By roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, one major expansion had spread through regions of Asia and eventually into Sahul. Other populations later moved into Europe, Northern Asia, and eventually the Americas. The planet became connected by human footsteps long before it was connected by roads. But there is one final detail. Humans did not simply travel because they were built for distance. They were built for cooperation. A person could walk only so far. A group could go much farther. Someone carried food. Someone watched for danger. Someone remembered water. Someone repaired tools. Someone cared for a child. Someone knew when the weather was changing, the journey belonged to everyone. That may be why the archaeological record is filled with evidence of people surviving injuries that should have ended their lives. Shanidar I, a Neanderthal who lived roughly 45,000 years ago, survived severe injuries and significant physical impairment. Someone with those injuries would have struggled to survive alone. Yet he lived. His survival tells you something about prehistoric movement that a map never can. Humans did not cross the world because every individual was capable of surviving alone. They crossed it because individuals could become part of something larger. A group could carry what one person could not. Knowledge could survive after the person who discovered it died. A root could become memory. Memory could become tradition. And tradition could move farther than any individual ever could. That is how the world slowly became familiar. Not because your ancestors knew where they were going. Most of the time, they probably didn't. They simply reached the edge of what they knew. Then someone stepped beyond it. Another person followed, then another. And after thousands of years, those small decisions had carried your species across deserts, forests, mountains, frozen plains, and oceans. You're alive because somewhere in that chain, one of your ancestors kept moving. The strange part is that you inherited the destination, but you did not inherit the map. You inherited the ability to keep going.